The harmonized tax law positions Indonesia's tax system for a major overhaul. This new law, which was ratified nearly a month after Indonesia's House of Representatives passed the Harmonized Taxation Bill on early October 2021, seeks to optimize revenue collection and improve tax compliance to boost the country's recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. It is certainly a step in the right direction, but any changes in law are never without opposition. The new provisions in the harmonized tax law will contribute to increasing tax revenue with a few key challenges to overcome in order to enforce compliance. Seeing the state of the economy, it is no surprise that the harmonized tax bill was quick to pass. As an E7 country and part of the elite G20, 20 of the world's largest economies, Indonesia had been making strides to reach the status of a developed country, with estimates that Indonesia's market would grow as early as 2024. Of course, the pandemic was not kind to anyone. Presidential Regulations Number 72 that was issued on 24 June 2020 was addressing that the state budget derived from tax for the 2021 fiscal year dropped from 1,229 trillion rupiahs to 1,142 trillion rupiahs. With the business sector playing catch-up and the government struggling to cover costs caused by the pandemic, something needed to change. And we're gonna give you a quick update. Harmonized tax law. Hope from increasing tax revenues, but not without challenges. Cue the harmonized tax bill, and preceding the law arguably being a strong indication that these changes are intended to help the economy rebound by increasing tax revenues as the new law alters several core provisions. Changes on personal income tax, corporate income tax, and value-added tax. Though some argue against the timing of the law and the changes in tax rates while the economy is still fragile, the harmonized tax law has the potential to generate up to 250 trillion rupiahs for the state coffers. A review of the law makes one thing clear: VAT revenue will be the highest contributor. By tariff increment, the VAT rate will gradually increase from 10% to 12% for almost all goods and services. The current rate of 10% will raise to 11% in April 2022. The rate will rise again to 12% starting on 1st January 2025. However, the exemptions to the change in VAT rate include staple items, healthcare, educational services, and social services. While VAT will be the heavy hitter in generating state revenue, changes to individual income tax and corporate income tax are not insignificant. Individual income tax will be lowered, contributing a minor amount and showing the most benefit to taxpayers. For example, at the current rate, an individual with a taxable income of 54 million rupiahs would be required to pay taxes in the amount of 3.1 million rupiahs. Once the harmonized tax law prevails, an individual with that same taxable income would only be required to pay taxes in the amount of 2.7 million rupiahs. In today's economy, every little bit helps. And how about the corporate income tax? Finally, it will stabilize at 22%, canceling the previous plan to change the rate to 20%. This is actually a welcome drop from the pre-pandemic rate of 25%. After COVID-19 began wreaking havoc in Indonesia, the government lowered the corporate income tax rate to 22% in an attempt to help businesses. Further tax cuts were adopted for specific industries, bringing the rate to 11% for some. However, the harmonized tax law dictates that the prevailing rate moving forward will be 22% for all industries. In response to the new tax rate set to prevail in 2022, there has already been pushback from disappointed taxpayers who do not agree with canceling the planned 20% corporate income tax cut. Though, to be fair, there is some reciprocal benefits from the taxpayer perspective. New tax changes have the potential to streamline the state budget and contribute to appropriate allocation, distribution, and stabilization. This will be a key element in providing much-needed support to corporate society, professionals, trade unions, and pressure groups that have been asking for these changes for a long time. The main concern from opponents is the wider economic impact from VAT increases. Estimates show that public consumption and real wages index may change -2.05 and -6.2 respectively, though import will show growth around 3.3. Several sectors may be negatively affected, especially utilities, which has the lowest projected sectoral output of -3.24. Additionally, there will be significant impact on changes to indirect taxation. From a regional point of view, the Indonesian indirect tax rate will increase competition among ASEAN country members, something many industries need to begin preparing for. The question that remains is, will the government overcome the technical challenges of enforcing the new law? Right now, the technological infrastructure is not where it needs to be, and both taxpayers and government will need to adjust. Not only will taxpayers be required to make changes, the Directorate General of Taxation needs to adjust the system used in the business as usual. These necessary alterations may create significant costs for both sides. The upcoming 2022 year will bring with it a lot of much-needed change to Indonesia, primarily in the form of the harmonized tax law's new rates for individual income tax, corporate income tax, and VAT. It has the potential to boost a pandemic-strained economy with significant economic changes that many businesses will need to plan for. The main goal of the harmonized tax law is to bring Indonesia's budget deficit back under the GDP cap of 3% by 2023. Despite concerns, outlooks remain positive, especially if the challenges of technical rationality, which covers the subject, object, tax base, and tariff, are overcome. The harmonized tax law might just be what Indonesia needs to move one step closer to developed country status, and struggling taxpayers will benefit from the small change to a lower income tax rate. So what do you think of all this? How will these tax law changes influence you or your business? The fact that the Indonesia's trajectory growth data from various institutions have become accessible is a fueling hope. Institutions include the World Bank, IMF, PwC, BCG, and government officials. All big players in the game predicted that Indonesia will be new economic powerhouse. Now, the question is no longer if Indonesia will grow its market, but when. Estimates range from 2024 to 2050, which is a huge gap. Thanks to the setbacks as a result of the pandemic, the business sector is playing a bit of catch-up. Regardless, many are seeing the huge potential in what's currently happening. There have been regular outcries for better infrastructure, better access, better know-how, and better environments over the years. Businesses need a certain level of digitalization, physical infrastructure, and solid supply chains. Economic society needs more access to key personnel, technical experts, and suppliers. Indonesia markets have also suffered from a lack of practical knowledge, an understanding of market expectations around custom and excise taxes, financial and record-keeping systems, manpower regulations, and requirements for permits and licenses. Finally, people want an improved working and social culture along with transparency and equal treatment. All of these needs have been exacerbated by the inevitable business climate in 2021, and we're going to explore the most recent business challenge, Indonesia VAT increase. What to do next? With so much going on, it's no wonder that the government is poised to support change. New tax changes have the potential to streamline the state budget and to contribute to appropriate allocation, distribution, and stabilization. This will be a key element in providing much-needed support to corporate society, professionals, trade unions, and pressure groups that have been asking for these changes for a long time. Omnibus law and harmonized tax law were being the government's response. Of course, the pandemic has slowed a lot of progress. The government struggled to boost their available programs within these past years. The government has made concerted efforts to increase the tax ratio by implementing the tax amnesty program, improving tax offices' service, applying the automatic exchange of financial account information scheme, and boosting law enforcement. Sadly, those efforts were not enough to overcome the evolution and revolution of business, nor confront dynamic multi-sectoral globalization. Those efforts also failed to combat aggressive tax planning practices. In order to overcome the state budget deficit and increase the tax ratio, The government needs to adjust and group everything into one comprehensive law as their fiscal consolidation strategy. This includes laws and regulations for general provisions and taxation procedures, income tax, value-added tax, excise tax, carbon taxes, and the voluntary disclosure program. If implemented properly, this change has the potential to accelerate the economic recovery drastically. The new tax system could be carried out by, to name a few, implementing policies to increase tax revenue performance, expanding the tax base, reforming tax administration, increasing voluntary taxpayer compliance, and creating a structure that is more efficient. The harmonized tax law is a step forward in the right direction, positioning Indonesia's tax system for a major overhaul. This new law, which was ratified nearly a month after Indonesia's House of Representatives passed the Harmonized Taxation Bill on early October 2021. The question now is, what to do next? To understand the impact of the coming changes, it's important to look at the bigger picture from the macroeconomic approach. There will be significant impact on changes to indirect taxation. From a region point of view, the Indonesian indirect tax rate in the harmonized tax law will increase competition among ASEAN country members. Southeast Asian countries set a quite challenging yet competitive VAT rate to attract investors. The Institute for Development of Economics and Finance, or we can call it INDAF, also offered key studies to capture how the new tax law might change the macroeconomics lenses. In their online discussion of VAT changes implications within the Harmonized Taxation Bill, their studies were showing that income and public consumption might enter a downfall considering the consumer price index possibly rise. The VAT rate gradual hikes are predicted to disrupt the growth of certain industries like textile, F&B, tobacco, electrical equipment, and utilities, with negative sectoral output and employment rate. Though nobody likes change, now is the time to get familiar with the new programs and amendments so you can plan solutions for your business and take advantage of what's to come. One of the priorities is looking at the future of your business. Regulatory changes will have varying degrees of financial, commercial, and reputational effects. Don't delay in evaluating potential challenges in your book's bottom line. Look at your technology infrastructure, procedures, compliance costs, and margins. Measure the impact of the changes on cash flow, compliance processes, and resources. Evaluate the finance function. Complete a financial model to capture and assess every impact across the value chain. This way, your business will be more than ready to roll in the upcoming years without unnecessary surprises. We also already mentioned INDEF study that predicting VAT rate increase impact towards sectoral output in certain industry. So, taking a deep dive into your business's commercial capacity is highly endorsed. How? You can start by reviewing your employees' workloads and compliance risks due to their potential for errors and the market, including customers and competitors. Continue by quantifying all changes to services and products related to how they're positioned in the market. You may find that some products or services are more or less competitive, while others are no longer viable. Next, review contract terms with suppliers and/or customers. Your tax team should lead this evaluation, ideally in collaboration with other affected teams like sales, procurement, and legal teams. Once you've evaluated each area and begun the necessary steps, plan for potential responses. Responses for all three impact areas should be reviewed together to uncover any overlap. The minute you've determined your response to regulatory change and how it will impact your business, it's time to craft newer and better strategies to manage it. Brace the impacts. Assemble a cross-functional team. The team's first task should be to develop a comprehensive project plan, outlining key deliverables, timelines, and milestones. Wait and see basically will not help you to run a seamless business. It is fair enough to take action after visualize the harmonized tax law impacts by actively manage VAT. Staying ahead of an ever-changing landscape is critical for compliance. Businesses must reassess their policies regularly in order to find better workflows. If an audit happens, how can it be smoother? Are data and contracts being stored correctly? Is there a point in the compliance chain that can be changed to help prevent future audits? As the part of your effort in managing VAT actively, effective uses of technology throughout the VAT lifecycle will also great to complement your strategy. In today's world, a business can't have visibility and properly manage its VAT compliance across multiple countries without using technology. Without technology, their level of compliance will never be where it should be. Companies that want to succeed need to have a central VAT function or outsource it. With your plan and cross-functional team in place, your next step is to decide how to communicate your plan to internal and external stakeholders, including tax authorities, staff members, and customers and suppliers. It is also best to schedule times to regularly update stakeholders as the project progresses. Finally, your team can execute the plan, and once completed, conduct a post-mortem evaluation. They should also continue to monitor responses and do follow-ups. Are not there yet? Think about outsourcing, co-sourcing, and insourcing. The challenge for many businesses is striking the perfect balance between outsourcing, co-sourcing, and insourcing. This ultimately comes down to individual needs and expectations. Businesses can't afford to delay remodeling their tax and finance functions if they want to be both compliant and a value-added partner. Most businesses will likely need to co-source some critical activities within the next 24 months so they can increase value, reduce risk, and decrease costs. Inevitable changes to VAT law could create liability issues for your company. This may affect the company's relationships with suppliers, employees, customers, and tax authorities. Provide a risk matrix. Realize that the possibility of non-compliance creates reputational costs. It's important to remember that taxes and laws are constantly evolving. There are pros and cons to every change, so the important thing to do is to create systems within your own business to prepare for the unknown. Reassess your standards regularly and create teams that can implement plans to keep your business compliant. By doing this, you can anticipate change before it happens and decide early the most efficient and effective ways to respond. And get involved with the people, institutions, and processes that drive and define regulatory change. You may just be able to help shape tax rules and regulations in ways that contribute to your company's long-term success. So, what do you think about all this? How VAT changes could influence you or your business?
You're asking me to be respectful and understanding of people who I totally disagree with?
Yeah.
That's insane.
That's what's going to save the planet.
Okay, if it'll save the planet.
Policy-wise, there is a wide range of instruments that countries can use to lower their emissions and ultimately shift from a fossil fuel-based to a low-carbon economy. Time to act now. The cost of inaction will be too high to handle and will place an overwhelming burden on future generations. A carbon tax is a possible solution, although it is not perfect. It is imposed on the carbon content of fossil fuel. Carbon tax concept is constructed on the notion that charging polluters based on how much they pollute will result in behavioral change towards greener practices. To achieve environmental excellence, both regulatory approaches and market instruments such as taxation and incentives are necessary. By placing higher taxes on carbon-based fuels, households, and industries, we can reduce the level of pollution and look to alternatives like solar power and hydrogen engines, which have lower impacts on the environment. And we're going to discover a global climate domino effect. Indonesia new carbon tax, the cost to live in the better earth.
It's not like we shouldn't have carbon generating things, it just should be a price on this stuff.
With the new carbon tax, Indonesia is reaffirming its commitment to reducing carbon emissions by 29% on its own and to 41% with international support by 2030. This was a target set by the Nationally Determined Contribution, a target that is now obtainable thanks to the carbon tax and carbon market roadmaps.
Our NDC has been updated given the strong political commitment by our leader, President Jokowi, how this is going to contribute the biggest reduction of the CO2, 650 million ton equivalent CO2 for 41% with international support.
The carbon tax will put a price on carbon emissions in order to persuade companies to use less. The main goal is to reduce the amount of carbon in the atmosphere and reduce the adverse effects of climate change. Considered a consumption-based tax or Pigouvian tax, a carbon tax raises revenue in a way that's economically more efficient than taxing income, making it a viable way to reduce emissions. To prioritize principles of justice and affordability, the carbon tax seeks to factor in the business climate and small communities. This change comes at a time when Indonesia wants to distance itself from its previous label as the world's fifth largest emitter of greenhouse gases. In 2011, Indonesia created the National Action Plan for GHG Emission Reduction, which included 70 multi-sectoral programs to reduce GHG emissions. In 2013, emissions were at 2,161 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, totaling 4.47% of global GHG emissions. Most of these emissions were from land use change and forestry, 65.5%, followed by energy, 22.6%, agriculture, 7.4%, waste, 3%, and industrial processes, 1.4%. Starting 1 April 2022, the carbon tax will take effect in the coal-fired steam power plant sector using cap and tax, a tax mechanism based on emissions limits. Before we continue, it will be great if you are aware that there are two main types of carbon pricing: emissions trading systems, or ETS, and carbon taxes. An ETS, sometimes referred to as a cap-and-trade system, caps the total level of greenhouse gas emissions and allows those industries with low emissions to sell their extra allowances to larger emitters. By creating supply and demand for emissions allowances, an ETS establishes a market price for greenhouse gas emissions. The cap helps ensure that the required emission reductions will take place to keep the emitters, in aggregate, within their pre-allocated carbon budget. Meanwhile, a carbon tax directly sets a price on carbon by defining a tax rate on greenhouse gas emissions, or more commonly, on the carbon content of fossil fuels. It is different from an ETS in that the emission reduction outcome of the carbon tax is not predefined, but the carbon price is. The choice of the instrument will depend on national and economic circumstances. There are also more indirect ways of more accurately pricing carbon, such as through fuel taxes, the removal of fossil fuel subsidies, and regulations that may incorporate a social cost of carbon. Let's get back to Indonesia. Coal-fired steam power plant will be the pilot sector in using cap and tax starting 1 April 2022. The government decided to implement carbon tax rate higher or equal to the price of carbon in the carbon market, with a minimum rate of 30 rupiah per kilogram of carbon dioxide equivalent. Thanks to higher taxes on carbon-based fuels, industries and households can reduce their level of pollution while exploring energy alternatives like hydrogen and solar power. Both of these options have lower impacts on the environment. And since the carbon tax is an excise tax that will increase the price of goods and services in the economy, it will reduce real after-tax wages. Additionally, it will not alter the choice between current and future consumption, and it does not directly impact incentives to save or invest. Individuals will have the same tax burden whether they choose to consume today or choose to invest their income. However, a carbon tax does influence investment decisions across different types of projects within the economy. Ultimately, it will reduce the demand for goods produced by carbon-intensive processes. Carbon tax raises the prices of goods and services. It can reduce real incomes earned by taxpayers. But because it's a consumption tax, it won't affect savings. Only capital income in excess of the initial savings would be taxed. A carbon tax will reduce returns to wages and the supernormal return to capital. Economists argue that a carbon tax is a powerful and effective policy to reduce emissions. In fact, it can also be an entry point to restructure highly subsidized fossil fuel-based economies. Yet a high tax policy is never politically popular. This is because it has considerable economic implications, particularly for low-income families. More tax will eat away the competitiveness of industries in the short run, yet the long-term benefits for the economy and environment outweigh the disadvantages. Best practices from other countries have proven that carbon taxes work. Sweden, Norway, Alberta, and British Columbia, both in Canada, Germany, and New Zealand are the pioneers at the forefront of the carbon tax movement, from which Indonesia can learn lessons. Despite the differences in the development stage, Indonesia still can learn a lot from Australia's experience in introducing a carbon tax, including its controversial revocation. Introducing a carbon tax is a challenging political decision. Therefore, it requires a thorough and balanced analysis among other policy options. Since taxation in general always invites public debate, introducing a carbon tax has to go together with strong public discussion. So what do you think about all this? Is this policy suitable for the country? Let us know in the comments section below. Make sure to like it, as now you know that carbon tax is a seriously powerful climate change strategy. Why not subscribe, as we'll keep on bringing more great videos like this. Until next time, see ya!